Today on Talk with Claude, we explore governing ourselves with Rob and the Pagé family 8 years after the making of the documentary Ungrip.
We raise our young to be dependent on the state, and when they physically grow up, the majority of the time they're not emotionally or mentally mature enough to be able to provide for all their needs. They don't have the skills, and so when they move away from home, they look for another parent, and that parent is the state. Martial arts too. I'm, third degree black belt in Taekwondo. And I learned through that is that physical work of our vessels automatically releases any emotions that we have stored in our vessel. And so when we're physically pounding tires with sledgehammers, that releases all that energy. And we did a lot of emotional processing in the building of these structures. And so when we say, there's blood, sweat, and tears, there literally was blood, sweat, and tears because, we did a lot of crying, we did a lot of laughing, healing, bonding. The vast majority of the work out here was done by my sons, my wife, and myself. And so our boys would, be responsible for filling the tires and, starting the compaction process. And my wife would follow with a 5-pound sledgehammer and continue packing them. And I would follow with an 8-pound sledgehammer and finish the packing and leveling. And we literally built these houses as a family, and we processed emotions and by me decolonizing myself and removing myself from being a work slave, I spent 10 years of my life full time with my sons to reconcile my relationship with them from the previous time in my life, teach my sons what it takes to provide for themselves, to be able to build their own shelters, grow their own food, look after livestock, ask questions. I taught them how to think critically. I didn't teach them what to think. I taught them how to think. And so if they have interests or any of that kind of stuff, then they know where they can go in order to teach themselves. So that was part of their homeschooling. We removed them from school and we taught them ourselves, and their education was, 10 years of experience in not only living off grid, but establishing the infrastructure so that we could live off grid. And that was their education, and that was the process that we went into in building these structures.
Yeah, people don't realize how much work it is, and it is very romanced, and especially right around that time, that 2008 to 2012, everybody wanted to be off grid, but I know a lot of people that went into it because of the romantic aspect of it, and I don't know a lot of people that are still doing it that went into it because it was kind of the in thing to do. Unless your spirit is guiding you there, it's going to be very hard, and you have to find your own way and your own manifestation, what your spirit is guiding you to do, I think, and you've done that very well. And yeah, I I remember my first winter, we wanted to have some chickens. And of course, chickens is the gateway animal to everything else. So we didn't have our own land, and it was illegal to have chickens in our little town. And so I just put it out there on the internet, does somebody have a little piece of land where I can keep my chickens, because I'm not allowed to keep them in my backyard. And this fellow answered back, and so we bought these 3 chicks, and hoping to have eggs for the next summer. And you start to think in really much longer terms than before. I don't know if you feel that way, but for us, we were very short-term oriented. Everything was next week or next couple of days. Now we're putting these chickens in somebody's yard and hoping for eggs in a year. That's crazy to think about, based on how we were living before. And so the funny thing is we went out and drove out down the highway in winter conditions through the summer to feed these 3 chicks that turned out to be 3 roosters. and yeah, just at the spring when we figured out they were roosters, an animal came in and took them all. So that was our first experience. And yeah, there's so much work put into it, and not everything works out. And you cry about it, and then you laugh about it, and you do it all over again.
This way of living is very different than the colonial way, and it requires that we think 12 months ahead of time, not 12 days or 3 days. Most people have like 2 or 3 days of food in their house, and that's it. We think 12 months ahead. And when we grow food for a whole year, and work on storing and smoking and drying and freezing and everything we could do to preserve food. But this lifestyle also requires a tremendous amount of health. And I'm not speaking physical health, but like emotional, mental, and spiritual health. Most people in the city, because they're still dependent on corporations for their food and their shelter and water and all that kind of stuff. They live codependently, and that's not a healthy lifestyle in my view. And that's something that I learned through my own recovery. And to be able to take that step to accept full responsibility for everything requires a tremendous amount of emotional and mental health and healing. And by moving off grid, it's an opportunity to do that work. But I find a lot of people run up against some core beliefs or barriers that prevent them from moving forward because they're not ready to let go and heal those. And so they then go back into the grid and back into the city. But for those that find the courage to do that healing, they can then take that step and then continue that journey. And those are the ones that find the path to making a successful foundational shift in their life, and can return to Mother Earth and really start to work on those spiritual relationships with the plants and the animals and Mother Earth and the water and the air, and really start to have some foundational spiritual experiences as a result.
Yeah, and on that matter, you start to form community relationships with different communities. The indigenous people around your area, and I've got a name up on my screen right now that says White Walking Feather. Can you talk a little bit about that and that relationship, because that was a very significant moment for you, and well deserving, I believe, for the work you did and the relationships you built.
Yeah. Over the last 10 years, I've had a lot of people contact me and say, can we move out there with you? And we tried a few of them a few times, but they always failed because they weren't independent yet. And they ended up establishing a codependent relationship with us. And that just was not going to work for us, because we're not looking for codependency. We're looking for independent relationships with ourselves so we can build interdependent relationships with others. And so whenever somebody comes out now and asks that question, I go, yeah, sure. Find some land, get your house set up, get your economy established. And when you found your independence, then come talk to us, and then we'll start working on our interdependent relationship. The 99.99% of the people don't bother.
Yeah.
Then in, I think it was probably 2012, 2013, fellow by the name of Ben Badger, his spirit name is Sweetgrass Sitting Bear, from Kewin Reserve near St. Paul. He watched Ungrip, And he goes, "Oh man, I'd love to meet that guy." And then when he found out I'm only a few hours away, he was like, "What? This guy lives in Alberta?" And so he reached out to me and he came to visit, and he absolutely loves what we're doing because it resonates with what he believes Treaty 6 was all about, where rather than the crown owning the land and controlling the land, the true spirit intent of Treaty 6 when it was signed in 1876 was that we were to share the land with one another. And, their belief, which resonates deeply with me, is that we don't own the land. There's no such thing as ownership because we're a part of the land. So the moment we claim ownership of the land, we enslave ourselves or enslave others. And I believe that's the foundation of poverty in the world today is this concept of ownership. But they believe that they're a part of the land, that we are the land. And when I take a spiritual look at it, it resonates with me because my vessel was, even though it was born of my mother, it developed within her using nutrients that she ate from the land. What sustains my vessel now comes from the land. When my vessel dies, it returns to the land. So it's just as much a part of the land as any other life form on this planet. And for me to try to isolate or detach it from Mother Earth is insane. It's completely dependent and a part of this planet. And so this relationship I built with him has grown strong over the years. And about 3 years ago, he told me that what we're doing here is a reflection of what they thought the treaty was all about. Because I'm not forcing my will on them. They're not forcing their will on me. We're sharing the land. I'm respecting the land. I see myself as a steward of this land, and it's my responsibility to bring prosperity to all the life forms, not just prosperity for me. And as a result, he invited elders out, and the elders believe that I'm on the right track and that I'm doing things the way that the treaty was supposed to be honored. And as a result, they invited me to ceremony about 3 years ago and gave me a white eagle feather with a spirit name of white walking feather. And receiving an eagle feather from the Kiyuman tribe nation is very much like receiving a gift from a high-ranking diplomat from another nation. It's one of the highest honors that we can receive from them, and so I'm deeply honored with the acknowledgement and recognition that I'm walking a path that resonates and honors the Treaty 6 and their ancestors and their way of life as we work really hard to walk a path that is not only sustainable but honors and respects all life on this planet and honors and respects all life that's going to be coming after us for the next 7 generations. And that's the way we should be living. And so that's why I share my story with people like yourself, so that we can start having these discussions on what it's going to take for us to get past this colonial commercialization, consumeristic type lifestyle, and really start to focus on healthy relationships with one another, and being honored with a white eagle feather and spirit name was probably the most beautiful gift I've ever received.
I think our relationship with the land has been very complicated over the centuries. And I've pondered about it a lot because a lot of it didn't quite make sense to me. And the things that you spoke about during that time with your relationship with your friend, and I remember you going through some of the clauses of Treaty 6 and what that meant and how you saw it, actually inspired me to see through the veil of the standard way of thinking of ownership. And instead, I planned relationships to have my animals. And because we were in a different situation and we were so far in debt over the construction of our very standard built house within the town site here, that even though there's plenty of land available, none of it, everything was out of reach as far as trying to purchasing it through the usual channels. But I told myself, well, if I start with the idea that, you know, even the land I'm supposed to own here, you know, I pay taxes on, and if I stop paying taxes, it's just taken away from me. So I quickly realized that I don't actually own the land. So having said that, neither does everyone else, and it's all a game we're playing, and it's costing us a lot.
Yeah.
And
yeah. And sorry. Go ahead.
Yeah, and so I put it out there to people's spirit to see if they shared in my vision of what could happen on the land that they controlled or that they sat on or they had papers to. And the response was beautiful. And that was back, I think around 2011, 2012. And we still have our beautiful little goats and sheep out there. And we've made ties with the local farmers for everything else and exchanges. And all of a sudden, because of that, we've become valued people within our community because we have something to share that wouldn't have happened if we had stayed blind to everything else outside this little cage that was built for us. So,
yeah, this is, this gets into, a topic I talk about in my book, Graduating Life with Honors. And I've written about it numerous times on my blog and on Facebook and that kind of stuff. And for some reason, people really have a hard time wrapping their head around it. But, this is the power of the fictional constructs that I talk about. But simply put, an idea has spread across this planet, and, people use the word colonization or colonialism, that kind of stuff. But essentially what we're dealing with is a group of royals using their military to conquer land across the planet with the authority granted to them by the Pope. We call it Doctrine of Discovery. And this whole idea is to claim title over all the land and turn everybody into feudal serfs. Now, the Doctrine of Discovery has three components. The Pope claims all the land. Pope claims our bodies. And the Pope claims all the lost souls. Now, if you think you're the name on your driver's license or credit cards, that kind of stuff, then, or even if you think that you're the body, then you're lost because you have no idea who you are. But when you start to explore the idea that you are a powerful spiritual being, then are you lost anymore? No. And at that point, the Pope no longer has a claim over you because you're no longer a lost soul. You are starting to explore the true essence and spirit of who you are. And at that point, you can then claim your body back and also claim the land that your body depends on and start to turn back the clock in regards to these claims that are being done through the Doctrine of Discovery. So as it sits right now, the vast majority of people are lost, and so they've automatically fall under the jurisdiction of the colonial empire. And that empire stakes a claim over all the land. So when you buy land or buy a house or that kind of stuff, you don't actually buy the land, because the land belongs to Creator and Mother Earth. But what you do is you purchase a title, which is a feudal tenure, from your lord and master, the governor general or lieutenant governor, to which is a grant for you to possess the land, and you pay rent, which is due every year in the form of property taxes. So you don't actually own the land. You have some rights in regards to what you can do with the land, but it's not yours to do as you please, or to build or that kind of stuff. Anything you do, you have to get a permit, which is a child asking the parent for permission to do something, and then you're open for inspections and all that kind of stuff. So this is all the foundation of what the government does today, and this is a lot of the deconstruction that I've done over the years to figure out just what exactly this relationship looks like. And if you want to dig into it further, there's a book called The Treaty of Copyhold that was written in 1817 or something like that, which exactly describes how the foundations of Canada and each of the provinces work to this very day. And there is a way to get out of that, and all you really need to do is declare to the court that you refuse to provide service. And at that point, all the tenures, so any titles that you hold, will be dissolved, and you are then free. But a lot of people don't know how to do that, and end up reconnecting themselves back in by asking for benefits or privileges from their feudal master, and which then just hooks them right back in. So when we walk away from the domain of the crown, part of that process is to ensure that we're completely independent, so that we're not receiving any benefits or privileges from the state, not holding any titles, and that we're completely free from their jurisdiction. Does that make sense?
Yeah. I don't know how much a new audience will follow into that, but they can certainly, there's a lot of material out there that they can start on, and hopefully this will be a starting point for them.
Yeah, I explain it in my book as well too, but the essence is, though, that the vast majority of people who are working at being free haven't done the work up front to provide all of their needs first before they say no to the state. And that's where the conflict rises, because they still depend on the state. In order for us to grow up and be self-governing, self-sufficient, 100% responsible, accountable adults, we have to grow up and provide for all of our needs. And humans are notoriously famous for being the only species on this planet that fails to raise our young to be independent. We raise our young to be dependent on the state, and when they physically grow up, the majority of the time they're not emotionally or mentally mature enough to be able to provide for all their needs. They don't have the skills, and so when they move away from home, they look for another parent, and that parent is the state. And so part of this journey is to start raising our young so that they can provide for themselves, so they no longer need others to provide for their needs, and they can look after themselves.
Yeah. Now, some people would say you were in a position to acquire a fairly large chunk of land, and I know that in the last period where you were more active with your posts on Facebook and other social media, you were exploring getting that land out of the manor.
Yep.
Can you tell me a bit about that process, how that research went, and how the process went, and where you've gotten with that? And
well, I'm still working on it, because I also recognize that it's not enough for me to get the land out of the manor, and the manor being the domain of the crown. And when you divide that domain up into smaller chunks, each one is a manor. And so, in feudal terms, the lord of the manor would be responsible for governing that piece of land. And so, like here in Alberta, the Manor House is the Lieutenant Governor's house. In Edmonton, the Lieutenant Governor is the Lord of the Manor. That's what we mean by manor. Mm-hmm. And the reason why we're dealing with poverty and all that kind of stuff is because people have been separated using fictional constructs from actually having access to land. And only the rich, or only people that have lots of money, have the privilege of having access to land, because you need money in order to purchase these permission slips or titles to get to the land. And for me, that violates the very premise of my spirit, because we are all part of this land, and we all have a right to the land, and we all have a right to the land in order to provide for our needs. And our needs shouldn't require jobs or money or that kind of stuff. We could eliminate poverty by removing these fictional constructs and rebuilding the skill set so that everybody can provide for themselves. And so part of what I'm working on doing right now is I've abandoned the idea of me doing it just for this land. I'm actually working on removing huge swaths of land from the manor so that lots of people can return to the land, especially people that don't have money to purchase these feudal tenures. And so what I've done is I've been looking at and leaning towards the idea that the Royal Proclamation of 1763 made a false claim by turning the indigenous people into feudal serfs without their consent. And that's since been put into the Constitution Act of 1982 by acknowledging the Royal Proclamation of 1763. I've also studied Treaty 6, which was signed in 1876, which used the term her Indian subjects to identify the individuals that they're signing a treaty with. And I haven't found any evidence to suggest that the indigenous peoples of this land, the Nihiwin of Treaty 6, actually swore fealty to the Queen to make themselves feudal serfs. And there's also wording in the treaty that stipulates that the agreement would be enforceable by both parties, that they would maintain the peace, and that they would share in the crown's prosperity. And the recent reports that came out showing that the Canadian government has been engaged in genocide shows that the government has engaged in fraud in this treaty, because they have not maintained the peace, or they have not maintained the terms and conditions that they outline in the treaty. I would also suggest that there's been some fraud involved in that too, because with my conversations with the Nihiwin people here, the term seed in the treaty, their interpretation was the term seed as in SEED, meaning planting plants to bring prosperity to the land. And the Crown views it as seed as in CEDE, meaning turning title over to the Crown. What the Crown fails to acknowledge and recognize is that the Nihiwin people function as a matriarchal society, which means the women actually have control and title of the land, not the men. But the arrogance of the crown stipulated that they didn't want to talk to the women, they only talked to the men. All the men could do, the chiefs, they only had the authority to establish a peace treaty. They had no authority to turn over title or control over the land. And that's why you hear the indigenous peoples all over Canada saying, we never gave you the land. Even the Wampum Belt, it's a treaty that was signed years before Treaty 6. It's a white belt with it's a blue belt with two white stripes. The two stripes represent the colonizers, the settlers, in a canoe going down the river, and the indigenous people in their canoe going down the river, as not crossing and us not interfering with the journey of either. And when we take a look at the actions of the Crown, they have violated that since day one, because their ideology is about war and conquest, where the indigenous peoples were about acknowledging and recognizing their role as stewards and honoring the spirit of the land and their connection with it. So when I do that research, I then have to conclude that the Crown has acted fraudulently since day one, and because Treaty 6 hasn't been honored and has been negotiated under fraud, that document is, on the Crown side, fraudulent. But the reason the Crown needed that document is because they needed something to prove that they had ownership over the land so they can issue land patents. And the land patents were issued on top of the Treaty 6, and they needed land patents in order to issue titles. And by proving that their version of the treaty is fraudulent, that means all their land patents are fraudulent, which means all their titles are fraudulent. Now, the implications of this is, could be a complete breakdown of our current economic and social models that exist here right now today on this land, when we acknowledge that everything that we do here is in fraud and at war and violence against one another. So part of this journey now is to then start teaching people, okay, all of these things that we've been depending on for at least 150 years since the formation of Canada as a, well, quote-unquote country. That's a whole other topic. Everything that we've been founding our lives on is a lie. And so now we're back to, okay, how do we deal with reconciling this relationship and working through the lies that we've been told by the people that are supposedly, quote unquote, governing us, and reconcile that so that we can not only heal from all these lies and the violence and the manipulations that have taken place in our life, but how do we then return back to the earth and help people make that transition so that we're not causing even more chaos or harm or hardship. How do we make that transition so that we can encourage more people to acknowledge the truth of what these relationships look like, reconcile our relationship with the Nehuan people in Treaty 6, and start to honor the treaty and return to the land and look after the land and each other in peace rather than continuing the war.